Well, welcome back, everyone. I am going to go ahead and pass it over to Paula. Paula is a long-lasting member of Midwest BDC and has been a part of the planning committee to put this on. So, Paula, if you're with us, I'm going to
Hey,
go, hey, I'm going to go ahead
hi.
and have you come on video and so you can introduce our next speaker. Let's see.
Okay,
Okay. I'm gonna give Paula a minute, but if you're having a good time, oh, Paula, you in the car.
I am, but I'm not driving.
Okay. Well, Paula, I'm gonna go ahead and transition over to you so you can introduce our next speaker.
Okay, as she said, my name is Paula Causey West, and I'm a member. Oh my goodness, it disappeared. I'm a member of the Equity Summit Planning Committee, and I'm a member of the Minneapolis Environmental Justice Coordinating Council. And it's my pleasure to introduce our closing speaker for our virtual Equity Summit. This session will focus on healing as an active and revolutionary practice. Healing justice sheds light on oppression and simultaneously uplifts the power of community to heal. Health and healing can be achieved by returning to ancient and traditional healing and earth and nature-based modalities and creating new practices to respond to our political and social context and our time, where so many systems are working to remove the autonomy and agency we have over our bodies as individuals. These practices are needed today, and we welcome Dr. Nzingha Dalila. Let me tell you about her. Dr. Nzingha Dalila is a clinical counselor and a clinical instructor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience at the University of Cincinnati over the last decade. Nzinga has also focused her research and community education on raising awareness among the Black community about the ecological dangers to the planet and what we can do to prepare both nationally and internationally on various podcasts, speaking on RBTSI, climate change, and the need for Black people to be prepared for the current and impending environmental threats to our survival as a community and to the planet. Dr. Dalila is the author of a self-published monograph, Ascension or Annihilation and Surviving the Final Threat to Black Lives. And she is the creator of the virtual educational program, Black People for the Natural World. She considers herself an impassionate environmental justice advocate fighting against environmental racism and injustice. Welcome, Dr. Dalila.
Oh, you're muted.
I realized I saw a little message. Hello, welcome, everyone. I'm so grateful and honored to be invited to be a part of this wonderful work that you all are doing. I just kind of came in at the end of the last presentation on bias. I wish I would have heard that. I'm sure it was sounded like it was wonderful. So I see you have my PowerPoint up, so I'll just tell you when to go to the next slide when I'm ready. Is that all right?
That's perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, the title of my program is Treating Race-Based Traumatic Stress Injury as a Revolutionary Tool in Fighting the Global Environmental Crisis. And so you can go to the next slide. I want to start off by talking a little bit about my own journey. I understand I'm probably preaching to the choir about this information, but as climate advocates, justice advocates, I'm hoping that some of this information might be helpful in all of us learning how to continue to grow in our advocacy work and reach out to others. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about my own journey. I think it's important. It's hard to talk about some of these things, the things that cause us pain that we've carried with us and that we need to heal from. And so I think that we as leaders can understand that we need to be vulnerable enough to be the first one to step out and share some of the pain that we've experienced. Um, I had, when I was about 18 years old, I was on a double date. Myself and a man and his girlfriend. And as the date went on, I realized that the woman, the other woman who was with us, she was lighter complexion. She had like a straight, kind of straight nose and long straight hair. And it seemed to me that the men were giving her a lot more attention and were kinder to her than they were to me. I went home after that date and I was so sad. I was sad and I was angry at myself. I hated myself. I realized at that point that I had internalized racism to the degree that I really hated myself. And I took something like this. These are my office scissors. And I took like not a nice pair of scissors, but just a regular pair of scissors. And I cut my hair off that night because I just couldn't stand looking at myself. And I share that because not because I'm against anybody wearing their hair any kind of way, but I'm sharing that story about me, about what had happened to me growing up with implicit bias and a lot of overt discrimination and violence. And so I want to share that with you that this was the beginning of my journey towards healing. So you can go to the next slide. In college, I started studying African American studies, and I became very passionate about trying to understand how to reach out to Black folks about our history and our culture so that we can begin to heal and feel empowered. And you can go to the next slide. That's just a picture of me in college. But so I'd like to talk about race-based traumatic stress injury. You can go to the next slide. It refers to the psychological and emotional harm caused by experiences of racial violence. Now, we often use the term racism, but I like to use racial violence. I think we need to understand that we have been and continue to suffer a great deal of injury from different forms of violence, such as bias, discrimination, harassment, and assault. You can go to the next slide. The impact of race-based traumatic stress injury can manifest in various ways, including anxiety, depression, hypervigilance, and hopelessness, which can deter involvement in advocacy efforts. And some of these things then will give birth to, I say, other issues such as substance addiction, sex addictions, violence towards each other. And so these are some of the things that result from race-based traumatic stress injury. You can go to the next slide. For African Americans, this can be a significant obstacle to engaging in social justice advocacy, including environmental justice and broader social justice movements. And we'll share that example of that a little further down. You can go to the next slide. One of the things that's really important to understand about the result of racial violence that we suffer is the fermenting of powerlessness. You can go to the next slide. Race-based traumatic stress can lead to internalized racism, which can lead to self-doubt and decreased self-efficacy, where individuals question their ability to make a meaningful impact in advocacy efforts. As I was sharing in my own journey, the beginning of my journey in hating myself, I grew up with children's books full of white children and white dolls, and watching television and movies that were not as culturally diverse as they are now. But even now, I think we still experience this internalized racism. I don't know if you're familiar with the white doll, black doll experiments that was done in the 1950s, and then later, 20, 30 years later, after that, that shows that children at a very young age began to internalize racist ideas and self-hate about themselves and doubt. You can go to the next slide. Some other things that happen as we experience this traumatic injury is when people experience trauma, whether it be these small, what we call microaggressions all through the day, every day, small injuries, biases, discriminations, or huge, large events such as violence. What happens is that when a person's traumatized, their life feels as though they're at the risk of ending their life, of coming to the end, or they witness something, or we even when we see on the news the violence that's met against people, black and brown people. And when we're traumatized, what happens is that we can't understand the world. The world doesn't make sense to us. We're trying to bring meaning to it. And this trying to bring meaning to it is something called the principle of closure. And so I have these two pictures on the slides here. One of them on the right, I think you can tell, isn't actually a triangle, but because of the way the picture is kind of formed, you can see a triangle in it. That's because our brain fills in the empty spaces and makes us see a triangle. On the right-hand side, there's a bunch of disconnected dots, but once you look at it long enough, you see some kind of animal, whether it's a big dog or a horse or something, but you see something in it because your brain fills in the gaps. When people are traumatized, we fill in the gaps by thinking, well, it must be us. It must be my fault. It must be that I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not worthy of being loved. I don't matter. You can go to the next slide. Another thing that happens with people who are abused is what's called trauma bonding, or what we used to call back in the days, the Stockholm Syndrome. It's what happens, it's a response to abuse that can create an intense emotional connection and attachment between someone who has been abused and their abuser. Because that person who's abusing you at some point is recognized as the person who is the source of your life, the source of nurture and substance. So you naturally create a bond towards that person. I think we have to realize that when we're reaching out and trying to help motivate and encourage people to engage in their own self-efficacy and advocacy for our lives, that these are some of the things that we struggle against psychologically. You can go to the next slide. So in my doctoral work, I began to ask myself, what is a way to measure how improving race-based traumatic stress injury can create improved behavior change? You can go to the next slide. What I did was I created something called the Social Justice Involvement Scale. You can go to the next slide. It's a psychometric instrument designed to measure social justice, racial identity, and feeling empowered. I want to talk a little bit for a moment about racial identity. Racial identity, although I think sometimes in our recent past has been talking about race has been given like kind of a bad name, like you're not supposed to be focused on racial identity. But it is such, we live in a caste system. We live in a society all over the world now because of empire, where people, because of the melanin in their skin, are treated differently. And Black folks are at the bottom of this caste system. And this happens all over the world where empire has taken over. And so our racial identity, the degree that we engage in embracing our racial identity is so important to our psychological, mental, physical, and spiritual healing. You can go to the next slide. In some of my research, what I discovered is that the quality of life is determined by the environment that we live in. As oppression increases, as we experience increased oppression, we experience decreased sense of self-worth and an increased sense of powerlessness. And as our sense of racial identity is compromised, as we fail to embrace and understand and celebrate our racial identity, we feel and experience increases amounts of stress and decreased motivation to engage in our own well-being. You can go to the next slide. So the results of my research in developing my scale was to show that the more one recovers from race-based traumatic stress injury, the more likely they are to be involved in social justice change. You can go to the next slide. So now I want to talk about race-based traumatic stress injury and global ecological crisis advocacy. Next slide. I want to talk about a little community called Bond Hill. Bond Hill is a community that I live in. I've grown up in Bond Hill for many, many years. In Bond Hill, there is an organization that has something called the Bond Hill Climate Safe Neighborhood Project. It aims to overcome climate change by promoting resilience. Now, Bond Hill is over 90% Black and experiences current and predicted impacts of climate change as a result of being in an urban area or a heat island, which I'm sure you all know much about. You can go to the next slide. In talking with some of the organizers of the Climate Safe Neighborhood Project, over years, I've understand that there continues to be, despite all of their efforts, a lack of sustained involvement and a lack of sustained motivation among the community residents. Based on my research, I believe that further work is necessary, that climate safe neighborhood programs can create projects that develop a sense of community, value, pride, and power. You can go to the next slide. As we talk about pride and empowerment, we also need to change the narrative. We need to also not talk all the time about scarcity and illnesses. Although these absolutely exist in our community, it's not all of who we are, but it's all of what we seem to see in the narratives about us, is that somehow we are just full of scarcity and illnesses. Go to the next slide. That idea promotes race-based traumatic stress injury. Instead, we need to start including in our narratives the history, the culture that's so wonderful and beautiful and powerful about not only who we were, where we came from, but who we continue to be and how we continue to be here. The next slide, please. We also need to begin to talk about degrowth as a revolutionary healing act. Next slide. We are in the midst of the sixth mass extinction that is due to overshoot of empire. Empire demands enslavement to maintain growth. Enslavement is supported by systems that ferment powerlessness. Healing means freeing ourselves by creating a degrowth society. So there's no way to get around it. We've become enslaved by the growth of empire. And the only way that we will be able, and this planet will be able to survive, is if we start also talking about degrowth. Next slide, please. When the masses of Black, red, brown, poor, and working folks recognize our physical, mental, and spiritual connection with the health of the global ecosystem, we will see that healing the planet and ourselves are one. We can organize our lives in a way that places holistic well-being at the center of human activity. Holistic well-being, the center of human activity, the center of being over profit. Next slide. I know that it can be very difficult. It's difficult for me. We all here using electricity, we're on the internet, we're on cell phones, everything we do now is connected and enmeshed with growth. Everything we do is always about how can we grow, how can we get better. But that becomes a mind trap. It becomes an addiction. And we must free ourselves from the addiction to growth if we're going to free ourselves from race-based traumatic stress injury, if we're going to free ourselves, period, if we're going to heal this planet. Next slide, please. People all over the world are working towards being free, working towards a freedom that includes living in a different kind of society, a society that's not focused on growth. There's people doing this all over the world, but we still have lots of work to do because we're losing entire species by the thousands every day. And this is connected to our own life, our own air, our own water, our future. So we have to continue to do this work. Next slide, please. What I'd like to encourage all of you as leaders is to think about measuring your approach to healing race-based traumatic stress and ecological advocacy, how these things work together in promoting success in our mission. Measure the degree to which individuals value their racial identity. Measure their importance to nature, to their own well-being. Next slide. I'd like to thank you all so much for allowing me to be here with you.
Hi. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. I got this double screen thing going on. So are there any questions? Are there any questions in the chat before we wrap up? Okay, Ashley, I'm sorry we didn't get to acknowledge your question. I was just noticing that. But Stephanie will be back tomorrow. And I'll make sure I take note of that. But are there any questions that we want to ask before we move into our closing?